Hey guys, it's Mike here, and I just watched Mandalorian Season 2, Episode 1, the long-awaited premiere of the fan-favorite series. Now, I really enjoyed Mandalorian Season 1, which I reviewed in this video that you can see here. In my opinion, it's the best Star Wars product that Disney's put out ever since they bought it from George Lucas, at least in live action. So in preparation for this premiere, I went back and rewatched the first season, which is still really good, although I did steadily become more aware of the formula that the show relied on, as well as some of the flaws. Nonetheless, I was excited heading into the season, and upon watching Episode 1, Chapter 9, The Marshal, I would have to say that it was a great kickoff to Season 2, and it's one of the best episodes of the series so far. So let's get into what happened right now, which is going to include spoilers for this episode, so if you haven't seen it yet, make sure to check it out and then come back to this review. So in this episode, Din Djarin was searching for information on the other Mandalorians who are off in space, in an attempt to locate someone who could help him find Baby Yoda's people. This led him to Tatooine, in which he encountered a local gunslinger, Cobb Vanth, played by Timothy Olyphant, a man draped in some very familiar Mandalorian armor. At first, these two gunslingers are at each other's throats, but soon they're forced to band together along with two rival factions, in an alliance of needs to defeat a terrible creature, the Sand Dragon, which threatens to devour them all. Now, this episode had a lot of good going for it, so let me get into that now, beginning with the great opening, in which the Mandalorian went down into the seedy underworld, in an underground fighting ring, in which he watched what is basically a glorified professional wrestling match, where we saw two of those alien species from Jabba the Hutt's palace in Return of the Jedi in an all-out battle against one another, which of course the shady people were betting on. Although unfortunately neither of them got eaten by Rancor here. And in there we had some great tension followed by some awesome action, in which the Mandalorian was double-crossed by the evil crooked mobsters, only for him to turn the tables and take everyone out, and leave the mobster boss to an apropos fate. And I definitely can't talk about the show or the Mandalorian without talking about Pedro Pascal, the man behind the helmet, who really carries the entire series, with his character being like a blend of old-school gunslingers from the Wild West, and the gritty ruthlessness and gadgets of a character like Batman. He was great in this episode as he always is, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more of what he does this season. The same could be said for Timothy Olyphant's character, who I think was a good choice of actor to come in and play the Cobb Vanth character, who himself is also a gunslinger that protects his town from raiders. I think this show did a really good job of making us care about this character, by showing us his backstory and flashbacks to when he was driven from his home by a mining faction, only to wander through the desert and then get the Mandalorian armor, which allowed him to take back the town from them. It's a nice story in and of itself, and it helps to develop his character more than pretty much all of the other characters that we saw in Season 1, giving us an introduction that automatically gets us up to speed with his character, which given what happened in Season 1, I'm sure he'll be returning for something later this season. And of course, Baby Yoda, the character who became a worldwide sensation and a meme, was also fun this episode, with them rendering his character through puppetry and other practical effects, which I really appreciated because it made him look more realistic than it did in Season 1. You can actually see him there and the characters interacting with him, rather than carrying a CGI bundle of nothing. However, he didn't really do anything this episode other than hang around in the background. I was almost expecting to see him lift up the Sand Dragon with the Force, but I feel like that would have been a little too overdone, and just turn him into a basic Deus Ex Machina, which the first season was kinda bordering on. Additionally, I think this episode did a great job with the world building. First with that underground fighting tournament and the mobsters in the underground seedy scene, but then also another great scene in which we saw Cobb Vanth and other people on Tatooine watching the Death Star explode, which is pretty awesome because aside from the people that were standing on the moon of Endor watching it explode from the surface, we didn't really get to see too much of people's reactions to the victory in Return of the Jedi, aside of course from the special edition where they added in a bunch of people just dancing around the streets, which was rendered pretty much entirely through CGI. That's one of the best things about the Star Wars franchise, how they're able to world build and expand upon places that, even though we've been to before, continue to show that there's so much more to them, such as Tatooine, which we've been to so many times before, and yet this episode still finds ways to show us that there's even more to that planet than we thought. The action was pretty fun throughout this episode as well, not only in the opening scene, but pretty much everything involving people banding together to try and take out this giant sandworm, which pretty much took up the majority of the episode, as the Mandalorian and Cobb had to gather not only the people from the town, but also the Tusken Raiders, and bring them together despite the fact that they had a lot of animosity towards one another, in a very classic kind of Western story, which seemed like it was also blended with what we saw in the first season, when the Mandalorian had to defeat the rhino-esque alien, and then retrieve its egg for the Jawas. But one of the things I always appreciate in Star Wars, especially when it's handled by people like Jon Favreau, is the greater focus on practical effects, such as the creatures, the characters, the sets for the towns. There's way more real practical effects that are actually in camera in this episode than much of what we saw in Season 1, which relied a little too much on CGI. Although not all of the CGI necessarily looks great in this episode, specifically some of the shots when Mando and Cobb are flying on their speeders. The cinematography was also improved overall, with a lot of sweeping shots that invoke classic westerns like the works of Sergio Leone, which this episode is very much a homage to. And also, just from the look of the show, they seem to be using better cameras and lenses, which makes everything feel even more cinematic than Season 1. And talking about that sand dragon creature, it reminded me a lot of the sandworms from Dune, as well as from Tremors. I don't know if you guys have ever seen Tremors, but it's a pretty underrated movie, starring Kevin Bacon, that spawned an entire franchise of horror-esque movies. I definitely recommend checking out that first movie, especially if you like this. And we can't talk about the show without also talking about the music, composed by Ludwig Göransson, with that great Mandalorian theme, which he incorporates and remixes in many different ways throughout the course of the show. It was great in Season 1, and it's great here too. And I always love when they show that concept art during the end credits. It's one of the things that makes me want to stay tuned until the end. But one of the best things I feel like really addresses one of the biggest complaints from Season 1 is the episode's runtime. This episode was close to an hour in length, which is longer than all the episodes from Season 1. And I feel like that shorter runtime was definitely one of the biggest problems from Season 1 because it made everything feel more compressed and rushed as a result. But here they're definitely taking their time more, which I think was one of the biggest positives of the episode, because if they were going back by that old 30 minutes plus runtime, then we probably wouldn't have been able to delve so much into Timothy Olyphant's character's backstory, or build up the kind of tone and ambiance that they were going for. And there was definitely some awesome badass moments from the Mandalorian this episode as well, such as when he literally goes inside the Sandrake in a scene that felt very reminiscent of what happens at the end of Hellboy 1, where he goes inside of the Eldritch Abomination with a pack of bombs, only for Mando to fly out at the end and blow him up from the inside, which was pretty cool. Now, talking about the cons, I do feel like there are a little bit too many conveniences in this episode. Like, for example, when Mando and Cobb are right about to have an old-fashioned shootout, the sandworm just so happens to show up and interrupt them, leading to them being friends, rather than killing each other instantly. Another thing was that Mando just so happened to speak the Tusken Raider language, which I said speak in this case because it seems like there's an inconsistency here where they actually changed how the Tusken Raider language works, because in Season 1 we were shown that they communicated mostly through sign language, which we saw in the Gunslinger episode. Yet in this episode, they're not only using sign language, but growling the entire time, much like the Wookiees from the Star Wars Christmas special. I don't know what it is about this show and reminding people that exists. Mando speaking to them felt like something straight out of Solo, a Star Wars story, which wasn't something I really wanted to think about while watching this, and neither was the holiday special. And of course, this just so happens to all take place on Tatooine, with familiar species and references to things that we already know as Star Wars fans, which ties into the show feeling like it dives a little too much into fan service at points. But it's not quite as in-your-face as some episodes last season. But honestly, I'd much rather have fan service like this than what we saw in The Last Jedi, which was basically just fan disrespect. And I also do feel like it does slow down a little bit toward the middle, especially during the scenes when they're talking to the Tusken Raiders, but I feel like that was likely done to develop this other community for when they all band band together at the end to fight the Sand Dragon. And another thing that always annoys me, and I'm sure a lot of other people, is the fact that Mando is always bringing Baby Yoda to dangerous locations where he can easily get killed. I understand that he probably has him with him because he knows that he's the only person he could really trust with Baby Yoda, and he probably thinks he's the safest with him, but when the last season he left Baby Yoda with the mechanic who is also still on Tatooine here, but then in this episode he brings him within eating distance of a giant monster. So it doesn't seem like Mando's necessarily winning any Best Father of the Year awards just yet. And I did hope that we would get some more developments related to Baby Yoda, but this episode largely served to give us a Western sci-fi inspired story and set up a presumed antagonist or perhaps anti-hero for this season, which gets into the ending of this episode, in which we got a really big reveal which a lot of people searched their feelings and already knew to be true. As we saw the Mandalorian getting ready to leave Tatooine, but then we zoomed back to the top of a rock face and we saw Tamora Morrison looking on, Boba Fett himself, who was revealed to still be alive, having survived the Sarlacc pit from Return of the Jedi. And this was something that already happened in the extended or now Legends universe. But now within the current canon, Disney is confirming that it happened here as well. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing his interactions with Mando, and perhaps getting a false Mandalorian facing a real one. Or maybe the two of them teaming up to fight Giancarlo Esposito. So overall, Mandalorian Season 2, Episode 1 The Marshal was a strong opening to the second season, giving us a taste of some familiar action before getting into the main story of the season. After this episode, I'm looking forward to seeing how the season unfolds. Although it would have been nice if they released it all at once, so I could just binge and review it, but it seems like streaming services are hopping on the once-a-week model for their big shows in order to keep people using their subscription. But as long as it's good, I'm going to continue to watch. So what did you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and enable notifications so you could see all of my content right away when it comes out.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.